Hello and welcome to the First and 10 podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Felts, here in Indianapolis, Indiana. Recording this here just a couple days before Ohio State on New Year's Day takes on the Clemson Tigers in the Sugar Bowl, a college football playoff semifinal rematch for a second straight year. We're going to be seeing the Buckeyes and the Tigers. We gave it its own episode a year ago. We're giving it its own episode this year. And here with me to break it all down is Reid Murray. What's going on, Reid?
Well, Patrick, you mentioned that game a year ago. I'm still bitter about that game. I think I will be for the rest of my life. And I don't want to talk too much about how I feel about that game, but let's just say I want revenge really badly, and I sure hope the players do too.
Well, let's talk about that game a year ago at least a little bit, because I think it's really important to contextualize that in the greater narrative that is Ohio State and Clemson, which is the game we're here to talk about. So, a year ago, Ohio State and Clemson are playing in the Fiesta Bowl, 2019-20 season. I believe it was actually a year ago on December 30th, maybe, or 29th, 28th, ballpark, late December. So this game a year ago, Ohio State, pretty much the whole first half is pretty much giving it to Clemson. They're up 16-0, but a lot of those drives that they get field goals on, they're stalling out, and they should have been touchdowns. So really, it should be about 24-0. You would think if everything's going Ohio State's way. So they left a lot of points on the board, and some questionable officiating calls, particularly an overturned fumble from Jeff Okudah and a targeting call on Sean Wade. And the fumble from Jeff Okudah gets returned for a touchdown. That's 6 points off the board for Ohio State. In the game where they lost by exactly 6, you do the math there. So a lot of things didn't quite go Ohio State's way, despite them really outplaying Clemson. I think they were a better team than Clemson. They didn't win the game, and they've had trouble with Clemson really forever. They haven't been able to beat this team. I believe, are they winless all time against Clemson, Reid?
They are. They've met 4 times. One of them was in the Gator Bowl when Woody Hayes was still coach. And the 3 most recent all came in the last decade. One of them was the Orange Bowl, where Braxton Miller was quarterback and Urban Meyer was still head coach. Ohio State lost that one in a heartbreaker. Obviously, everyone knows the 2016 Fiesta Bowl when Ohio State lost 31-0. I still see memes about that to this day. And then last year, the playoff semifinal. So yes, Ohio State 0-4 against Clemson. And honestly, this is kind of becoming one of the biggest, or not biggest, but one of the most entertaining rivalries in college football. I think you could call it a rivalry at this point, how often these two teams meet in the playoff or in the postseason. And there's a real hatred brewing between these two teams. So hopefully it'll become more intense in the near future if Ohio State can actually get a win and Clemson has something to be mad about.
Well, and the Ohio State players hear everything, and the fans and the coaches, they hear everything. They hear everybody talking about how Clemson owns Ohio State. They're their daddy, all that. They hear this. They aren't deaf. They're not deaf and blind. No earmuffs and blinders here, like Tom Allen would say. But they know everything about the circumstances. This isn't news to them. They know that they've struggled with Clemson, and they know that everybody knows it. And they know that nobody thinks they're going to win this game. And they know how disappointing last year was. They've got some massive chips on their shoulder, and Ohio State has a lot to prove, because another thing they know is that Clemson coach Dabo Swinney has no respect for them. He's been talking for a long time about how Ohio State doesn't deserve to be in the playoff. Reid, how do you think this motivates the Buckeyes?
Well, I want to say it motivates them to the extreme, and that they're going to want to come out here and just play the best games of their lives. And first of all, get revenge in Clemson, and also just for the sake of making it to the national title game and competing for a championship against likely Alabama. But I mean, when you look at how Ohio State's played this season, they've shown no heart throughout the year. And on one hand, they haven't really had to. Their schedule hasn't been too hard. No disrespect to Indiana in saying that their schedule wasn't very hard. But Indiana was their hardest game. They weren't 100%. They still came away with a win against Northwestern. They struggled, and they eventually pulled out a win. But even then, very little heart was shown throughout the season. Very little effort, or I wouldn't say effort, but not a lot of passion in Ohio State's game. And the one time you really saw some passion was the first few minutes against Penn State when Ohio State came out firing. But even then, they let off the gas. So I honestly don't know how much faith I can put into this year's Buckeye team to actually have the passion and be motivated to pull off an upset of this magnitude.
You know,
Um,
and with that, it feels like everything has kind of been given to this Ohio State team. I'm not saying they don't deserve to be in the playoff because looking at the resumes of every other team in the nation, I think they do deserve their playoff spot, and I think they certainly have the talent of a playoff team. They are good enough to be in this position, but a lot of things along the way, big things and little things, have kind of just been given to them. They've just fallen into place. They feel like they deserve some of these things just because of the name uh, that they have of Ohio State. They're Ohio State, so they deserve to go to the Big Ten championship, even if the rule says they didn't play enough games. Jeff Akuta, he's not on the team anymore. Sean Wade was supposed to be a really good player this season, so yeah, sure, we'll put him on first team All American, even though he's been absolutely terrible as an outside corner versus as a slot corner in 2019. A lot of these things, big and little, have just kind of fallen into place, and it doesn't feel like a lot has been earned. They're going to have to earn this one. And you can say they had to earn that one against Northwestern, but I think that's only because they weren't expecting to have to earn that one. Against Northwestern, they thought it was going to be a cakewalk, and they were in for a rude awakening. So I thought it was going to be a cakewalk too. So that's on me too. But they were not ready for that Northwestern game. They were not prepared. And lo and behold, Trey Sermon ended up bailing him out. But, this team has not really given their all this season. And they're going to have to give their all and then some if they want to win this game, because Indiana's a great team and Northwestern's a very good team too. But Clemson's a different animal. And they know that. They've played this team before. It's going to take everything they've got to take down Clemson, because not only is Clemson kind of goes without saying, they are really, really good. This is a Clemson team that is peaking at the right time. They are playing their best football we've seen from them, maybe in the entire Trevor Lawrence era, with that game against Notre Dame. That was one of their best outings I've seen from him.
Yeah, and the reason I say an upset of this magnitude, when you look at the two teams on paper, you see two well-coached teams with great quarterbacks and talent all around. They recruit extremely well. They usually put a good product out on the field. So on paper, this ought to be a very close game that's decided by about 3 points. But Ohio State really just seems to be cursed when it comes to Clemson. And it's going to take a lot for them to actually end up winning this game. And like I said, the lack of passion, the lack of heart, the lack of drive that we've seen this season concerns me. And it makes me feel like Ohio State, unless they find some kind of new gear to kick it into, watching their performances throughout the season, I don't know that they can pull off a win.
This has been a season on cruise control for Ohio State, really. And you could say either that's because maybe they overlooked the Big Ten and every team they had to play in the Big Ten, but you could also say, yeah, no, they were overlooking the Big Ten. They're just not, they don't really have that, killer instinct that you need to win a championship or get to a championship. So there's that. Or maybe they were just kind of a playoff team by birthright. They knew that they could just coast and get to the Big Ten title, even if they couldn't get to the Big Ten title and the rules had to be bent. They knew they could do that, and they were just ready for Clemson. It's kind of felt like they were preparing for this game for about a year. In all honesty, they really weren't. This is the one they've had circled on their calendars. It's kind of sounded like, from everything I've heard out of this Ohio State team in press conferences and releases and all this interviews, it's felt like they've been looking forward to this one for a year since that loss to Clemson last season, which kind of made it feel like they knew that this was going to happen, even though it was by no means a guarantee for them to get to play. So this playoff by birthright thing, I think Ohio State expected to be in the playoff, and that could be a good thing to be confident, but at the same time, you can't just expect to be in the playoff and cruise through your schedule and then suddenly turn it on for the playoff. That is tough, and I think that's what they're expecting to do, and they might be in for a little bit of a shock.
Yeah, and when I talk about this team not having heart throughout the season, there's two sides to that there's two sides of that coin or that argument, whatever you want to call it. I mean, you can say this team has had no heart, no passion throughout the season, and that's going to be a problem for when they take on Clemson. But you could also take the approach of, well, the reason they've looked so lifeless is because they want to face Clemson. So any other team on their schedule, it really means nothing to them. So hopefully the latter is true, and it's all because they've been saving something for this Clemson game. And hopefully if they do beat Clemson, the Alabama game. But again, like I said, right now, it's just hard to put faith into this team.
Yeah, this is not last year's Ohio State team. Last year's Ohio State team came out in every game except for honestly the Wisconsin game of the Big Ten championship, where they inevitably found their footing by that second half, and uh, that Clemson game, where even in that Clemson game they came out and they dominated Clemson from the first whistle. Every game last season, Ohio State was pretty dominant from the get go and just kept their foot on the gas all afternoon, all night long. That Clemson game they did, but they just weren't converting because Clemson was just a different team. They had a different skill level. So when they could get down to the red zone, that Clemson defense just stopped them, or Ohio State shot themselves in the foot. More often than not, it was Ohio State shooting themselves in the foot, which was a common theme throughout that game. Uh, Officiating aside, Ohio State did a lot of very stupid things in that game. It's like this is just not the same team as last year. They don't have that factor of where they're going to come out every game and just put the beat down on somebody. They did it against Michigan State. I think they have it in them somewhere, but I don't know if they have it in them to do it week in and week out like we saw from this 2019 team. They got to find it in them again to come and do it in the Sugar Bowl, or else it could be a long night for the Buckeyes.
Yeah, you're right about that. And, I think we've talked a decent bit about heart, but I think now we got to go talk about the actual product on the field and what it's going to take for Ohio State, their players and their coaches to actually come away with the win and beat this Clemson Tigers team who lately, especially the last game they played against Notre Dame, looks pretty unbeatable. And obviously no team is unbeatable, but Clemson has looked about the nearest thing to it, especially just the way they dominated a team who was number 2 at the time, still in the top 4, Notre Dame. They look scary. So for Ohio State, I've got some keys to the game here. The first one has to be on offense. You got to beat Clemson's defense with speed. This Clemson defense, they've looked kind of slow, and especially when you have fast players, especially running backs, they can toast them. So run plays with Trey Sermon, read options, plays where Justin Fields can scramble, short passes and slant routes, which are perfect for Chris Olave. And especially now that Trey Sermon has emerged as a true threat, Ohio State can not only have a dangerous running game, they might want to look into running some read option plays, or really more read option plays than they have in the past, because they have a running quarterback. And in addition to that, they have a true threat at running back. And you can say they can go for play action, but I think this is a game where the run game and the short pass game are really going to prevail for them. So beating them with speed, especially on the ground, is going to be huge for Ohio State to get points on the board.
Yeah. And you're talking about this run game for Ohio State. Uh, it's Trey Sermon. And what are we going to see from Trey Sermon? Because we've seen 2 different Trey Sermons this season. Reed, which Trey Sermon do you think shows up? Because he really showed out in that last game against Northwestern, and that's really the only time we've seen that this season. I mean, it was the best game by any running back in Ohio State history. So you think he can come and do something kind of like that again? Obviously not to that same extent, because nobody in Ohio State history had done that before him. And what are the odds of doing that in back-to-back games? But you got to think he's found a kind of a new footing here, and that this run game as a whole, I think, has found, pardon the pun, it's got a new ground. They are, they're moving better than they have all season, particularly in that Indiana game too. That was how Ohio State ended up holding on and winning, because Master Teague had a great game. So the run game is going to be important, but you think Trey Sermon's going to be the guy?
Well, I sure don't think that Master Teague is going to be the guy. I mean, I think Teague is good,
Yeah.
but it takes him a long time to warm up and really find that gear that he had against Indiana. And you just don't have that kind of time against Clemson. You don't have that time to experiment and play around and let him find what works for him. It's going to be Trey Sermon, or it's going to be nothing. And I don't think that Trey Sermon does that record-breaking performance again, like you said, against Northwestern, but I think he does something similar to it. And I think he gets, at the very least, 150 yards in this game, unless Justin Fields ends up running it more than he does. But I think Ohio State on the ground this game is going to have to find a way, and I think they're going to find a way to pick up solid 5-10 yard plays on a consistent basis, consistent enough to put together full drives. So I think they do it. I think Trey Sermon shows up, because we saw what he did at Oklahoma. He was a big game player. He showed up all the time, especially in Big 12 championship games. He was that guy, and I think now that he's finally found his stride, I don't think it was a one-time thing. I think this is the Trey Sermon we're seeing now, and this is the Trey Sermon he is. So hopefully he continues that, and they're going to need him to, quite honestly, because as good of a quarterback as Justin Fields is, you don't know how much you can rely on him in a game like this. And I think he's going to be, I mean, he's got to be better than he was against Northwestern, but even then, you can never count on him too much, especially after the way he played last time out.
And in
So I
Ohio
think the run
State's
game is going to be key.
Ohio State's two biggest games of the season, Justin Fields has had his two worst games in a Buckeye uniform against IU and against Northwestern. So with Fields, you just don't know what you're going to get. You can hope that you're going to get the Heisman hopeful Justin Fields. You're going to get the one you saw against Michigan State. You're going to get the Justin Fields you saw against Penn State. But you don't know, because it's just entirely possible that we see what we saw against the two best defenses and the two best teams Ohio State's played all season, where they had to rely on that run game to basically win it for them. So, it's going to be interesting. But one thing that is changing from that Northwestern game is you're going to have maybe your most important player on offense, and in Chris Olave. I wouldn't call him the best player on the offense, but he's the glue that holds that whole offense together. He is just ultimate Mr. Reliable. And Reed, you've hammered on this point pretty much ever since we started the podcast, but there's not a more reliable player in the country than Chris Olave. The dude just catches passes. And although there was one pass he didn't catch against Clemson last year that, lo and behold, ended up being the final nail in the coffin. So with Olave in particular, I think there's another revenge factor, and I think there's a revenge factor for this whole team. I mean, I've seen videos from their workouts in their training room and their locker room where they have last year's score on TVs everywhere, 29-23, Clemson versus Ohio State. That's everywhere. So there is a revenge factor for everyone here, but I think particularly for Chris Olave, there's one. And with Olave too, him being back in the offense is really going to help them get back into rhythm. And Jackson Smith-Njigba being back too. That's the other thing. I believe since Olave's back, I believe that means Smith-Njigba is going to be back too. I'm not entirely. I haven't seen the final. I haven't seen anything about Smith-Njigba, but I assume since Olave's back, he will be too. But having both of those guys in the lineup for Ohio State, I think is really big.
Yeah, I agree with you. And when it comes to Justin Fields, my second key has to be to deal with pressure well. Fields cannot get sacked, both for injury concerns and just to not lose yardage. I mean, Fields, he's been a player who's been dealing with injury for a while. I mean, there were injury concerns last season during that Wisconsin game and even in the playoff game. And he's been a player to play through it, but any injury or lingering injury that there is right now cannot become worse. So avoiding sacks is going to be huge. And the Clemson D-line is really good at keeping their opposing quarterback inside the pocket. The way they blitz and the way they rush that quarterback, they make it hard to escape. But when they do, or when that quarterback does escape, there's all kinds of time and space open, especially when the linebackers come and they blitz 7 or 8 guys. It's really going to be a one-on-one between the receiver and the defensive back. So if Fields can roll out of that pocket, set his feet, and make a throw, not only is he going to make more accurate throws, and he'll have all the time in the world that he could ever need, it's going to be a one-on-one between an Ohio State receiver and a Clemson defensive back. And I like the Ohio State receiver's chances in that matchup. And we saw in both of Clemson's meetings with Notre Dame this season, one way the Irish really exposed that Tiger defense was by getting Ian Book to roll out, find his receiver, have time, but especially just give the receiver more time as well. And when he gets outside of that pocket, there was way better passing opportunities. So for Fields to be able to avoid sacks and to get out of the pocket, that's going to be a huge key on the Ohio State offensive side of the ball in the passing game. And speaking of Notre Dame games, Clemson safety Nolan Turner, who was the player who caught that game-winning interception last season that you just mentioned, he is out for the first half of this game from a targeting during the ACC championship game against Notre Dame. So I would say this is a huge blow to the Clemson defense. And if Ohio State can attack the hole that this creates early in the game, it could serve them well later on.
Yeah, and another thing, you look at this games against Notre Dame, I believe that there are blueprints to beating Ohio State and to beating Clemson. Clemson has obviously lost a game, and Ohio State has been able to lose too, and they've really squeaked it out against Northwestern and against Indiana. There are ways to beat both of these teams, and I know the coaches know it better than I do, but and Reed, you're breaking it down just as much as I am. I remember for Indiana, it was pressuring Fields a lot. That was one of the big things they had to do, make him uncomfortable, get him to throw bad passes, something he doesn't do often. So you got to force turnovers that way, but by sending the house. But for Clemson, I think if you shut down ETN like Notre Dame did, and you look at his stat line against Notre Dame in that first game, 18 carries, 28 yards, 1 touchdown. That's 1.6 yards per carry. If you shut down ETN, Lawrence is going to get his no matter what. And DJ Ukulele got his against Notre Dame in that first game too. Trevor Lawrence being gone was not the reason Notre Dame lost that game, or Clemson lost that game, rather. That was not why. They lost that game for a multitude of reasons other than that. And I think one of the big ones was just a terrible Travis Etienne game. So then you look at the second meeting between these two teams, 34-10 Clemson. Travis Etienne, 10 carries, 124 yards, and a touchdown. So that's the difference maker. And Etienne was a big difference maker last season too, in a lot of games for Clemson, including this Ohio State game. He had a good game. But I think for Ohio State, the run defense has been good all season long. I'm not concerned about Ohio State's run defense. If you can keep Etienne to maybe not quite the game he had against Notre Dame in that first one, but something kind of similar to where you're keeping him under 70 yards and a touchdown, then I think that'll give you a chance to win this game, because when Etienne gets rolling, Clemson's tough to beat.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that is going to be a major part. And my final key for the offense for Ohio State has to be to just make the simple plays and avoid mistakes as much as possible. We've seen throughout Justin Fields' career, Ohio State can air it out. They can throw the deep ball, but they don't have to, nor should they in this game too often. Maybe throw a deep pass on the first drive, see how it goes, and do 1 or 2 per quarter, I'd say. But they should not be relying on the deep ball this game. We saw, like you said, there's blueprints to beating these teams. And one thing that you can see Notre Dame's offense did well in their win was focusing more on short plays, short slant routes, and just short routes in general, which Chris Olave has been really good at, especially crossing routes. That's one of his main attributes, is his ability to score and get huge yards on those. But run plays, short passes, just getting 5-10 yards and not necessarily airing the ball out too deep. That is going to be a huge key for their offense. And another thing is just converting on drives. We talked about this earlier. We talked about last year's game. They put together drives early. They had no trouble doing that. And throughout Ryan Day's tenure at Ohio State, they haven't really struggled putting together drives. That's what they do. But what killed them last year was not being able to convert. And it was the same thing against Northwestern last week. They didn't convert. They put together drives, and they ended up having to settle for field goals. And sometimes they missed those field goals. They cannot settle for field goals too often. They need to kick field goals as little as possible in this game. And when they do, they cannot afford to miss them. And one final thing when it comes to avoiding mistakes is they need to not commit penalties as much as possible. And we've seen throughout this season, one thing Ohio State does a lot is they commit a lot of holdings that go uncalled. They're going to be officiated by refs who are not from the Big Ten and may call holding way more often. So avoiding penalties, especially the holding penalty, that's going to be huge. And I can see it right now. Ohio State putting together a brilliant drive, getting a great touchdown, and then 15-yard penalty for holding. And it's something that happens not very often, or at least they're flagged for it not very often. But they do commit a lot of holdings, and they've got to stop it this week.
Oh,
they cannot afford to lose yardage because of that.
And the saying in football, there's a holding on every play, right? But with this team, they hold way more than they should. And a lot of them are really obvious and they get away with them. And the Big Ten refs don't call them. You're absolutely right about that. They get away with a ton of holdings, particularly in that Indiana game. They held all afternoon long. And as
I knew you'd bring that up when I made that point.
Oh, of course I'm going to bring it up, because the officiating in that Indiana game was so lopsided in Ohio State's favor. And we saw it last year with the Clemson game. It's not going to be lopsided in Ohio State's favor. I can almost guarantee you that Clemson is going to get more calls that go their way than Ohio State does. Versus in a Big Ten game, Ohio State's going to get every call in the book. So you have to be prepared for that. And that sounds like a stupid thing, referee bias or whatever, but it's real. I mean, I wouldn't talk about it, and it wouldn't be a thing that we talk about after every game, and everybody talks about after every game. Oh, the refs hate us, yada, yada, yada. Sometimes it's like, come on, get out of here. But sometimes you're actually completely justified in saying that. And I think with Ohio State, you can be completely justified in saying that after, say, the Shaun Wade targeting last year, where Trevor Lawrence dips his head and absorbs the blow after Shaun Wade's already launched. A couple other times in that game, there were some stupid penalties. I don't remember them all off the top of my head. It's been a year, but officiating changes games. It just does. And you're not going to have the Big Ten rest for this one. And that is going to make a huge difference.
Yeah, you're right. And let's move on to the defensive side of the ball, because I think this is where Ohio State is going to have the most trouble. And I think one of the biggest things Ohio State needs to do in this game is to not overcommit. And I think when it comes to Ohio State and defense, they should try to pressure the quarterback as much as possible. But the only people who should be doing that are the defensive linemen, because Lawrence is really good at evading pressure. And even if you send all the defensive linemen and all three linebackers, I feel like Lawrence is still going to find a way to scramble or hit a pass downfield. And especially if you blitz all your guys, that leaves you with one-on-ones between the receivers and the Ohio State defensive backs. And the Clemson receiver is going to win that battle 8 times out of 10, most likely. So I think the main goal of Ohio State defense, especially the linebackers, is to stay back and give them a few yards here and there, give them first downs, let them get into field goal range, give up field goals. But the main goal has to be to keep them out of the end zone. Avoid the big play and avoid allowing touchdowns to happen. And I think if you give Clemson 4 big drives and they score 12 points from it, and you hold them to a field goal every single time, that's much better than holding them twice but giving up 2 touchdowns. And I mean, obviously that's 14 is bigger than 12, but just in general, I would rather Ohio State give up drives consistently and have them end in field goals than come up with a few sacks, come up with an interception or so, but also give away a 70-yard pass here and there. So I think a big strategy here has to be sit back, make sure Clemson does not get the big play and they don't get into the end zone. That's going to be a huge part of keeping Trevor Lawrence from going crazy in this game. You don't want to be put on a highlight tape. You don't want to have Trevor Lawrence run for 50 yards like he did, or 50 yards on one play like he did last year. That was one of his huge plays in the game last year. You got to avoid the big gains. And I think that's one thing Ohio State is going to need to win this game.
And you talked about how the Clemson receivers are going to be the Ohio State receivers or Ohio State defensive backs pretty regularly. And we've seen that against a lot of teams, particularly you look at that Indiana game. Ty Freifogel had an incredible game. Just unbelievable. Ty Freifogel broke so many records. But, I think you do a little bit of the opposite. You were saying to kind of be kind of safe with those corners. I think you take some risk. I think you send some corner blitzes and some safety blitzes, because if you already know that your corners are going to be losing those matchups, then why not give them some room and try and get a sack and try and swing the momentum of the game, because you're going to have chances to. It's not like you trust your defensive backs if you're Ohio State, because you really shouldn't. So why not say, all right, we're going to send you in a blitz and try and take down the quarterback, because we want to get a positive play going for our defense. And we know for a fact that our defensive backs aren't making that positive play by themselves on a regular coverage.
Well, one reason I want the linebackers to stay back and we don't want to be doing defensive back, or not, I shouldn't say we, I'm not the head coach, but I think Ohio State shouldn't be doing
Coach Murray.
Defensive back blitzes, is I think you want to make sure that the linebackers are a part of pass coverage. And you want to make sure that it's not just defensive backs on receivers. You want to have linebackers in there picking up a receiver, maybe double teaming a guy here and there. And especially Justin Hilliard last week, he got 2 picks and he's a linebacker. The assumption is that Baron Browning is going to be back this game. He was out last week because of COVID, and that's part of why Hilliard was able to get in and have such a good game. But the assumption is Baron Browning is going to be back, and they both like to play that Sam linebacker role. But honestly, you might want to move Baron Browning into the Mike role. Keep Hilliard there covering the receivers. And I think it's best to keep linebackers as part of the pass coverage. And I mean, I'm not expecting them to come up with 2 picks like they did last week against Trevor Lawrence, but have them batting balls down, have them being a factor that limits Clemson's passing game. Because I think if you just blitz the linebackers, blitz the defensive backs here and there, you're going to give up you're going to give up too many of these 50, 60, 70-yard passes. And I think that's going to be a huge reason why Clemson could win this game, is if Ohio State does allow too many of those one-on-ones between wide receivers and safeties, it's done. Clemson is going to win that one-on-one battle every time.
Yeah, and another thing you have to keep in mind is Ohio State is an underdog here, a big underdog by their standards. They're almost never an underdog, and I think they're gonna have that underdog mentality on their side. This is a classic nobody believes in us game because, quite frankly, nobody believes in them. Nobody thinks Ohio State can win this game, so they're gonna have that chip on their shoulder. But at the same time, maybe nobody believes in them for a reason. Maybe it's because they are big underdogs and the odds of them winning this game are slimmer than almost any other game we've seen from Ohio State in a long time. So you got to take some risks on both sides of the ball. And I think defensively, you're going to want to take those risks on sending a corner to try and, maybe on a third down. And we saw this, let's go back to that Shaun Wade targeting call from last season. So it's a 3rd and 5 late in the second quarter. And Clemson's got the ball barely in Ohio State territory. If there's no targeting call there, that is a gigantic loss. That pushed them back from, I believe, the Ohio State 46 to the Clemson's own 39-yard line when they sent Shaun Wade on that blitz. That is a game-changing play. And yet, once you give them that 15 yards, that allows Clemson to get on the scoreboard, completely changes the outcome of the game. So, you got to make some of those risky plays because if they pay off, that's going to be one of the only ways you can win this game. Because if you just play a straight up game of football with them, just X's and O's, nothing crazy, I don't think you're going to win this game if you're Ohio State because Clemson is just playing on another level right now. So you got to take some risks. You got to swing for the fences. And sometimes you're going to strike out when you swing for the fences, but sometimes you're going to hit a grand slam. And I think if you're Ohio State, you got to look at that risk reward and know that the odds of you winning this game as is are not great. Clemson is a heavy favorite, and yet got to take some risks because that's the way that an underdog wins a game.
Now, I see what you're saying there, and I'm not opposed to the idea of a defensive back blitz every now and then, but it's just
and you
like
can't do it too often, obviously, because then
it's
they're
just
going to
like the
start.
deep pass.
Well, then they're going to start calling around it, and that defeats the purpose because it's almost a sneak attack, if you will. But I'm curious, Reed, offensively, what do you do if you're Ohio State to shake things up?
Well, I mean, like I said, the deep pass, the deep ball to maybe the Justin Fields deep ball to Garrett Wilson. I say try that once a quarter. Maybe if it works early, do it a little more often, but that shouldn't be a major part of the play calling scheme. Ohio State, they can shake things up with a deep pass. So here and there, but I think overall they might not need to shake things up. I think if you can just get chunk yardage, run some read option plays, get Justin Fields to run with the ball because Lord knows he's been not the best passer lately. If you can just get these 10, 15-yard gains on the ground, they might not even need to shake things up with a big play, to be completely honest with you.
Shaking things up with a big play isn't the only way to shake things up. You can shake things up by playing it in extremely conservatively, by running the ball for 3 downs and, getting 4 yards a carry. That's another way of shaking things up. That's not a traditional game plan, but, just going in with the game plan, say they had against Penn State or against, I don't know, Northwestern, that's not going to cut it because if you're just going your guys versus their guys for 4 quarters, I don't trust that. So I think you got to do something a little different, catch them off guard because if you're Ryan Day, this coaching matchup is going to be tough because Dabo Swinney's not only an incredible head coach, but on that defensive side of the ball, they've got Brett Venables, who's a wonderful defensive coordinator, and Clemson's defense is always going to have something ready to dial up at a moment's notice for about any scenario. So in your back pocket, if you're this offensive coaching staff, if you're Kevin Wilson, Ryan Day, and all these guys, you've got to have something in your back pocket ready to pull out at a moment's notice to catch them off guard. And you got to have that ready. I think just about every drive, you got to be doing something. If one thing isn't working on the first drive of the game, then I think you completely switch it up on the second drive and try something else because you can't get too complacent with this game or else you're going to bury yourself a gigantic hole, and coming out of a hole against Clemson is next to impossible.
And, hopefully there will be some kind of magic play like that. The last time Ohio State was in the Sugar Bowl, the pass from Evan Spencer to Michael Thomas at the end of the half.
And it doesn't have to be that crazy, but something just a little out of the ordinary, something maybe they didn't even see it on tape or they saw it on tape once. Uh,
Yeah, and I don't like the idea of Ohio State running the ball 3 downs over and over and over because eventually Clemson's going to stop that. But and I'm no play calling mastermind, but here's how I would really call the plays, or this would be my sort of game plan. First drive, I'd start the game off with a simple run play. Second play of the game, I'm going deep to Garrett Wilson, or maybe deep to Chris Olave. I'm going deep to somebody, whoever's open. Hopefully that works out. If it
like a
doesn't,
heat check. It's a heat
regular
check.
drive. And after that, we're doing read options. We're doing handoffs to Trey Sermon, and then a play action pass every 3-4 downs or so.
Yeah, but I think this offense, from what we saw against the Northwestern Wildcats, it's going to be run heavy, more run heavy than you'd see maybe in other games from Ohio State in other years, and more run heavy than you'd expect. Even going into that Northwestern game, you weren't expecting, a Trey Sermon best running back game in Ohio State history game, but that's what we got, and I think he's going to get a level of trust from these coaches, and he's going to get the touches necessary to make that happen.
And when you mentioned the run game for Ohio State, one thing that Dabo Swinney's been complaining about going into this game is the lack of tape on Ohio State. How they've only had 6 games to watch Ohio State play, and throughout those 6 games, it's been the pass game that really won it for them. They hadn't had to run it too much. This is a really whole new variable for Clemson to have to look at, and who knows? Maybe they over prepare for the run, and that allows for a way bigger passing game. And I think Ohio State's going to win the game, or I don't think. I think if Ohio State wins, is going to be on the ground. But who knows? It's entirely possible that Clemson is totally ready for this run game, and as a result, they leave the pass game wide open, or more wide open than we're anticipating. But let's go into my final key on defense, and I think this is the biggest one of them all. Just be tough. Ohio State, they've had trouble tackling for years, pretty much ever since I've been an Ohio State fan, and especially the last few years. The biggest example of it has to be that Purdue game, that huge upset. I mean, Ohio State, it's like Rondale Moore.
Rondale Moore was covered in butter.
Butter
Yeah.
smeared all over them. But
Wait, did you say that too?
I'm sorry. What did you just say?
I said Rondale Moore was covered in butter.
That is exactly what I just said.
Oh,
yes.
Man.
Great minds think alike. But Ohio State, they've struggled tackling, and this is how Travis Etienne kills you. He gets yards after contact. First of all, they need to just get there. They need to hustle and make a tackle, but especially they cannot let Etienne pick up 2 or 3 yards after contact, especially on a consistent basis. That kind of stuff needs to stop. They need to tackle better. They need to do it consistently, and just limiting yards after contact is going to be something that you might not notice when you look back at the highlights of the game. But if they do win this game, that's going to be a huge reason why.
And ETN last season against Ohio State, he didn't run the ball particularly well. That was all Trevor Lawrence. ETN in the passing game was deadly, though. He was their leading receiver, and he had 2 touchdowns. So you got to worry about him coming out of the backfield as well. And I talked about ETN as a dangerous player, and you got to shut him down like Notre Dame did if you want a chance to win this game. So that's a twofold problem right there. You can't just shut him down in the running game. You got to shut him down in the passing game too, because he can kill you both ways. He's got that speed and that elusiveness that so few guys possess. He is just a game-changing player when he's at his best.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And having him there to if Lawrence doesn't have that passing option, just dump it off to him. That could burn Ohio State, and that's another reason why. It's just you got to be able to tackle. You got to be able to limit yards after contact. And this is what I mean when I'm talking about limiting the amount of blitzes you run. Even if Lawrence doesn't get out of the pocket and you sack him now and then, there's always the chance he escapes, he goes and scrambles. You need the linebackers there because you can't be letting the DBs be the last or the first and last line of defense and allowing Lawrence to go run for 20 yards. And in addition to that, if it's a passing play and Lawrence is going to pass it, there's no options. If the DBs do, by some miracle, lock everybody up, Etienne's going to be standing right there. So you need to have somebody there who's going to limit them from getting that 20-yard gain. Because like I said, it's going to be big gains that's going to ruin this Ohio State defense. They have to limit the big gain as much as possible. And I think that, in addition to just tackling well, limiting yards after contact, the 2 biggest keys to this game.
And Reid, you talked about your 5 keys to this game, but I think one of the biggest things that we're going to have to see from Ohio State is Justin Fields, obviously. I mean, he is the star of this team. If you ask the average college football fan who's the best player in Ohio State, even if me and you might not think that's the case for this season, it's Justin Fields. I don't think he's been the best player on this team this year. I think he certainly is the ceiling of it, but he's just not played up to that level. a lot of games. I would argue maybe Haskell Garrett's been the best player a lot of weeks, or Chris Olave even. Uh, Fields has been inconsistent. He's had 4 really good games and 2 pretty terrible games. What do we need to see from Justin Fields for Ohio State to win this game? And what are we gonna see from Justin Fields in this game, Reed?
Well, he's been talking about how he's preparing for this game in a way that he's never prepared for a game before. And
He
while that's
certainly
all
didn't
good and
prepare for
well,
Indiana or
yeah,
Northwestern.
and
The
while
way
that's while that's good and you want to see that, at a certain point, it doesn't matter how much you prepare. If you have an injured hand and you're a quarterback, you're not going to be at 100%.
And that's
So
the
I
other
think the
question.
biggest factor in
What
this
is
game is
his
not Fields' motivation or his preparation. It's going to be whether or not he's healthy, because even if Fields is at 70% accuracy, or he's playing at say a 70% level, if his health is not 100%, that's going to be the biggest issue. You can have a 100% healthy Fields who's playing his 70% skill game, and he's going to tear you apart on defense. So it's really Fields' health that's the biggest problem. I don't have any issue or any concerns about how motivated he's going to be, or how well he's going to play apart from his injury. I mean, he's the one guy in this team who you can, or not. I wouldn't say one guy. I don't want to throw the entire team under the bus. But Fields is the biggest leader on this team. He's the guy who, like I said, he's a leader. He motivates the team. He's that guy in the locker room who stands up and really gets the guys going in a way that Dwayne Haskins really couldn't before him. So I don't really have any concerns about how Fields is going to play apart from his injury. And I think at the end of the day, if Fields is not 100% healthy, or even maybe 80% healthy, that's what's going to burn them, not how motivated he is, or how accurate of a passer he is, because he's an accurate passer. It just comes down to his hand injury.
Well, with Fields, Justin said in his press conference the other day that his thumb is fine and that he is going to be okay on Friday, and that it's not going to be.
But of course he's going to say that his thumb could be not fine. He's not going to tell you.
He's going to say that. But at the same time, it's like if he said anything not completely certain, if there was even a modicum of cloudiness around it, then I would be like, all right, his thumb's going to be an issue. And I guess we're going to see on the first drive of the game, is Fields firing on all cylinders? Does he look like the Fields we saw against Michigan State? Does he look like the Fields we saw against Northwestern? So that's the question. That's really the $1 million question for Ohio State is, which Justin Fields do we see? What's his thumb like? If his thumb's okay, like I think it's going to be, I think we're going to see a really, really good game from Justin Fields. And maybe we see that same Trey Sermon we saw against Northwestern. And if you have Fields against Michigan State with Sermon against Northwestern, I think they can win this football game, even though I think that they are going to be severe underdogs here. I don't think there's any reason to see them as the favorite going into this game. I think they can win. I think there is a clear path for Ohio State to win this game.
Yeah, talking about Fields' health, and in that press conference, I mean, I'm not going to say he's like a liar or anything, but Fields is the kind of guy, and I'm not going to sound like Skip Bayless here in talking about how being injured or being, not at your best is a sign of weakness, but that's just who he is. He's not going to show any kind of advantage for the other team, or any kind of reason why he is not going to be his 100% self, and why he's not going to be a problem for the opposition. So Fields, no matter what condition he's in, he's going to act like he is, like he's never had a better day in terms of health. So yeah, like you said, we don't know what it's going to be, and we're going to find out soon enough. In this game, like I said, there's a recipe for Ohio State to win. And there's a recipe for Clemson to win. But at the end of the day, I just think Clemson on offense is a stronger team. And I think this is going to be a shootout of a game. And I think the final score is going to be somewhere in the 30s and 40s. I mean, as much as I want to pick Ohio State, and I've damn near convinced myself Ohio State's going to win doing this research and finding out this is how we win, this is how we do it.
Do it, Reed.
On one hand, you feel like Ohio State's cursed against Clemson. There's no way they can beat them. It's just like Notre Dame in the postseason. It feels like they're never going to win. But on the other hand, I just think Clemson is a stronger team overall. And I think especially the fact that their defense is better. I think their offenses are pretty level. The fact that their defense is better, I think that ends it for me. I got Clemson winning this one 38-27.
Reed, I don't know. This is a tough game to pick. Ohio State is a little bit owned by Clemson. Ohio State is not as good as Clemson. Nobody thinks Ohio State is going to beat Clemson. I think Ohio State is going to beat Clemson. I'm taking Ohio State 38, Clemson 34, Sugar Dome or Sugar Bowl, Superdome magic back on Ohio State's side in those white jerseys. I'm insane for picking this, but I just feel like everything's going to go right for them finally. Nobody believes in them. And because of that, I think they're going to have a massive chip on their shoulder and they're going to play their hardest that they've played all season. I think this is the one they've been looking forward to. We have not seen Ohio State at their best, and I think this is going to be Ohio State at their best. I think this is the team we've been expecting all season. I think they're going to come out and they are going to beat Clemson. I'm taking Ohio
Patrick,
State.
this game right here is what Andy Murray would call an emotional hedge. Or this pick, rather.
Not the tennis player.
Yeah, not Andy Murray, the tennis player. I should clarify. I'm talking about my father, Andy Murray, not the English tennis player, or is he Scott? Whatever, the British tennis player. That is not who I'm talking about. But this is a term that he would use to describe a game where your pick and what you want to happen are different, and it's a win-win, but it's also kind of a lose-lose. I'm picking Clemson primarily in my own self-interest to avoid a jinx. I don't want to pick Ohio State and have us lose the way we did last season. But also, it's just this type of game. I know if I were to pick Ohio State, we wouldn't win it. And I just feel like, and
the RJM curse.
At the end of the day, I do believe Clemson is a stronger team. And I hope and pray that I'm wrong. And I've never wanted to be more wrong in my 1st and 10 picking career. And I'm not usually one to pick against Ohio State. Oh my God, this one. It hurts me to do it, but I just feel like Ohio State, it's going to take a miracle for them to pull out a win against Clemson, and I just feel like this year's team isn't the one to pull out a miracle. And I think if it didn't happen last year, it might not happen for decades. So Clemson 38-27. I think at the end of the day, both offenses have their, they have their success, they get their way. But at the end of the day, Ohio State's defense is not one that's going to come up with a crucial stop to win the game. And I just think that their defense doesn't allow them to stay in this game. And I think it stays close for a while. Actually, I'm going to go back on that. I think Clemson gets up early. I think Ohio State makes a comeback. But at the end of the day, I just don't think it's going to be enough. And the offense, as good as it is, I feel like there's going to be some kind of play like that Chris Olave won last season where it looks like it should go their way and it just doesn't.
I'm with you that this could go disastrously for Ohio State, but I kind of just think it's not going to. I have just a feeling, Reed. I've got a feeling that they are going to just come out and have a little bit of fate on their side. I don't know about you. Is there any way you think that happens?
Oh, there's definitely a way it happens. I mean, like I said, I almost convinced myself Ohio State wins this game by doing this research. I think Ohio State, motivation aside, can win this game just on purely football. I think they can earn a win here. And I mean, Dabo Swinney himself even said it. He was talking about how, first he made his comments about, or he didn't make his comments. He made his ballot where he had Ohio State at number 11, clear sign of disrespect. He later went back on that and said, well, obviously they can beat us and they can beat anybody in the playoff. I just didn't want to put a team who has played 6 games in the top 10. My top 10 barrier was you had to play 9 games. So Swinney himself even said that anybody or Ohio State can really beat anybody. So there's certainly a possibility, and
yeah,
Ohio
he said
State
all
has
that,
the players to do it.
But you think that? What do you think is going on the whiteboard or the TV in their locker room? You think they're putting Dabo Swinney, Ohio State can beat anybody, and they're like, "Thank you, Mr.
I know what
Swinney."
you're saying.
You think they're saying,
My point
"Thank you,
was
Mr.
simply that-
Swinney," or you think they're saying, "You said what? You put us where?"
No, yeah.
You
That's
think
my point is just
we don't
that,
deserve to be in the playoff
that even
over
Swinney
who?
himself
Over
admits Ohio
Cincinnati,
State
who we
can
beat
win
by
it.
42 last season. You think that's what they're saying?
Oh no, my
I don't know
point
if you
is
heard that
simply,
part, but he did say that Cincinnati deserves to be in the playoff over Ohio State.
now, yeah. Now my point is simply just
That
that it's
is-
possible.
That is going to just make them so upset, I think. And that doesn't necessarily translate into a win, but I feel like all the circumstances surrounding this game and all the Dabo Sweeney running his mouth is about to get shut down. I think it's a little bit of a talk that talk and then you get punched in the mouth sort of game.
Now, let me tell you this, though. I think if Ohio State wins this game, it's going to be similar to the Michigan game in 2018, where everything looks to be going Michigan's way. They have every reason to win, and Ohio State just plays a perfect game. Everything goes their way, and they win by 20-something points. I think if Ohio State wins this one, it will be by 3 possessions. I think it's either a I don't think Ohio State wins a close one. I think if they do win it, it ends up being not quite a blowout, but a pretty decisive win. I think if it is a close game, Clemson comes out on top just because that's the way these things go. But I think, honestly, I think for Ohio State to win this one, everything's got to be perfect, except for maybe the DBs can be bad. But other than that, the wide receivers have to be on. Justin Fields has to be on. Trey Sermon has to run the ball effectively. The linebackers have to actually tackle. And I think it's just hard to count on all of those things simultaneously happening. And I mean, this would be awesome. It would be it's a huge test for Ryan Day, to see what he's made of as a coach. Last season, he got beaten by this team. And I think it's going to be a testament to how strong of a coach he is. If he can pull out a win, I just don't think he's quite there yet. I think Clemson has the slight edge in just about every area of this game, other than obviously the motivation factor. But I mean, Clemson, even they get up for games like this. Clemson's never been a team who sits back and isn't motivated. So, like I said, this game can go either way. I cannot put my full faith in Ohio State, and obviously I don't want to jinx them. So Clemson is my pick. 38-27 is my final score.
I think Ohio State is going to dominate the stat sheet if they win, which I think they will. I think statistically it'll look like they should have won by more, but they won't because Clemson's going to find a way to be in it no matter what. I just kind of think Ohio State's going to win it.
Well, Pat, I hope you're right. I've never hoped a pick of mine, like I said, it is wrong more than I hope this one is incorrect. That's all I can really say is I hope I'm wrong. I hope, Patrick, you come away with, I wouldn't call this the craziest upset of the season. I wouldn't call this the just absolute bonkers pick, but it's certainly not the favorite. It's not the expected pick. So hopefully you get this upset right. I'm rooting for you in terms of picks here.
Right. Well, the biggest upset.
Hopefully my team can prove me wrong.
It's hard to think it's anything except for Penn State versus Maryland.
Yeah, and I mean, last time
Penn State against Maryland.
Yeah, and I mean, last time Ohio State was in the Sugar Bowl, people have been talking about it's a similar scenario. Ohio State, they go into the Sugar Bowl as the team is counted out. Everyone says they have no chance. They don't deserve a playoff spot. That's a huge similarity. Is 2014, they said you don't deserve this spot, and this year it's the same way. There's every reason for Southern critics to say, "Oh, you didn't play a full schedule. You don't deserve your way in." Everybody feels some type of way about Ohio State this season going into this game. So, I mean, maybe there's some Superdome white jersey with the throwback sleeves magic going on. I sure hope there is. And I mean, Ohio State, they've owned the Superdome last 2 times they played there. They beat Alabama and Arkansas in 2 different Sugar Bowls. So I'm hoping and praying, but it's so hard to pick Ohio State over Clemson the way that, I mean, you look at even the 2013 Orange Bowl, Ohio State, I would argue they should have won that game. And it just seems like no matter how well Ohio State does, they're not going to come out on top. So I got the Tigers in this one. Pains me to say it.
We're going to see Friday night, Reed.
And speaking of Friday, Patrick,
I know you're looking forward to it.
Obviously, we are a Big Ten podcast, but I'm curious as to your pick in the other semifinal, Alabama, Notre Dame. Who you got in that one? And what's the score?
It's not a question of who wins, but rather does Alabama cover? And I think Alabama is going to crush them. I think Alabama is going to win this game about, let's say, 44-17.
Yeah, that's a fair pick. I feel like this game is going to go similarly to the Alabama-Washington Peach Bowl a few years back. The same year Ohio State got beat 31-0 by Clemson. I think when you look at Notre Dame, and because I was watching a lot of Notre Dame Clemson film, which is really what makes me think this, Notre Dame's game against Clemson, you can look at that and say, well, this is the Notre Dame postseason moment where Notre Dame They look rough. They can never pull it off in the postseason. But when you really look at that game, they had momentum early. They were putting plays together, and there was just little mistakes that kept them off of the scoreboard. It could have been a much closer game if a few little bounces went their way. So I think this Notre Dame team is a much more put together and much more well-prepared team than we saw last week. And I think if they limit a few mistakes, they can keep this game close. I mean, hell, Florida almost won the game last week, and I think Notre Dame's a better team than Florida. So I think Notre Dame can keep it close. I don't think Alabama completely blows them out of the water, but Alabama is the stronger team. They will earn the win, and I got them 33-17.
All right, and that'll do it for our show today. Thank you so much for listening to the First and 10 podcast. For Reid Murray, I'm Patrick Felts. Friday night, yeah, we'll see which of our predictions comes true with this Ohio State versus Clemson game. Should be a fun one. College football playoff doesn't get much better than that. And we will see you next time. Bye.